Good afternoon. Welcome. This is building your own widget with the ArcGIS JavaScript API. My name is Matt Driscoll. I'm here with the co-presenter, Juan Carlos Franco. He goes by Franco. We're both the widget guys of the API. We work on the widget framework and also build widgets for the API. These are our Twitter handles if you guys want to tweet us, follow us, whatever. So on the agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about widgets, what they are, how they're used, stuff like that. Then we're going to go into the widget framework and how you guys can use that to create widgets. We're going to cover a little bit about styling and what we use to do that. And then we're actually going to walk through building a widget. So, widgets. I'm going to turn it over to Franco here, and he's going to talk a little bit about widgets.
Thanks, Matt. So first of all, we know widgets are kind of encapsulated UI components. We write them because we want to be able to use pieces of UI. They're typically cohesive, so everything inside of it is related. It's kind of goes back to the whole modular aspect of them. And they're single purpose, making them focused. So ideally, you want your widget to be as focused as possible, so kind of making it easier to reuse all over the place. Why we want to do it? Because, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that our widgets are reusable. You don't want to write the same thing all over and over and across your different applications. It also allows us to make our widgets be interchangeable. So if you have a button widget, since it's isolated and it's its own thing, if later on you bring a different framework or implement an enhanced version of it, you can swap it out. It makes it easy. And for this session, we're going to show how to do this by explaining how our base widget class works. So let's go a little bit into more details behind this. In version 4, all of our widgets have a view and a view model component to them. And what this means is that we're just keeping our concerns separated, so everything that's UI will be handled by the view, and everything that's business logic will be tackled by the view model. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because it makes these pieces more reusable. So, for example, if you had your own UI framework of choice, you could go ahead and re-implement your own view, and all you need to do is reuse the view model, and you have the core logic of the widget right there for you to use. And another reason is it makes it easier to integrate in other types of frameworks. So if you're bringing in the JavaScript API and another application framework, you can just bring the view model and just worry about implementing the view yourself. Or if you already had, actually, no, yeah, that's how it would work. You would bring in the view model and just leverage the APIs and just keep on following the way you would structure the UI or build your UIs in your application framework of choice. And our widgets, all of them, we build them with TypeScript, and you'll see across our snippets and the widget we're going to be actually building, you'll see everything is in TypeScript. And we won't go into much detail about how to use TypeScript, but we will call out some of the features that we're leveraging. So as I mentioned before, views, they tackle the UI aspect of our widgets, and they are extending the base widget class. They will rely heavily on the view model. So the view model, the idea is it'll provide all the APIs to keep the view simple and clean. And so essentially anything that's UI or DOM, user experience related, will belong in the view. On the other side, view models, for example, will be extending Esri core accessor, and this is the base class for all of our classes in the JavaScript API. And it gives us a lot of neat stuff from the ground up. So, for example, the way we handle properties, if you've seen any of our examples, you see that there's a lot of ways. There's a common pattern for watching properties when these change and reacting to them. So that's one of the things we get out of the box with Accessor, as well as a simple way of constructing classes. such as the unified class constructor pattern. So you instantiate a class, you pass an object of values, key value pairs, and they'll be assigned to the matching property. So the idea is that the view model will provide APIs for the view to actually be able to represent its visual state, and anything that is not UI, business logic, will belong in the view model. So if you have anything fetching resources, or if you need to convert any data into more view-friendly value objects, the view model is a good place to have those concerns. So just kind of a very high-level way of how these two pieces work is that the view will be rendering its state, and the state can be either a mixture of its own properties or variables and the view model properties. And the view will be calling into these APIs, which will essentially be causing a change on the view model itself. Or some of these APIs, for example, a method may return a promise that's going to be resolving at a later time. And the idea is that once those changes occur, the view will be updating. And there will be, the widget will go into these steps multiple times depending on however many times the widget rendering is updating. So this is our base widget class, and it gives us a life cycle. And this is pretty neat because we get some specific hooks that we can leverage to know where to set, for example, event handlers, where to focus our rendering logic. It also provides API consistency since it's extending accessor as well. We get the same patterns, the same features out of the box, such as unified object constructor properties, defining properties, and watching these properties as they change. So for the life cycle, we start with a constructor which gets invoked immediately once you create your widget instance. Then comes, going back, this is a good place if you wanted to set the binding for any of your functions, or if you needed some logic that really needed to execute early on. Then comes post initialize, and this will be called when all the properties are fully initialized but the widget is not rendered yet. So this is a hook that we use common in our widgets, and we use it to set up any watchers for properties and any extra initialization logic. We use post initialize for that. Then comes render, and I'll go more into details in the next slide because it's one of the key aspects of widgets. And then later on destroys a function that you would invoke whenever you want your widget to free up its resources and make it ready for garbage collection. So render is a very important, one of the most important aspects of your widget, and it's where you will be defining your UI. And you'll see an example of this later on, but the idea is that based on whenever it gets called, you would use the current state to be able to build that UI and represent it in that time, in that snapshot. And we use JSX, and this is just a syntax that is similar to markup, and it eventually gets compiled to JavaScript, but it's nice to see that it represents markup that's going to be very close to what you would expect to see in the browser. And another aspect to notice is that whenever you're dealing inside of the render method, you're not really dealing with the browser itself. It's all virtualized. So we have a virtual DOM system behind the scenes, and what render returns is a virtual representation of the actual node, and some other part of the virtual DOM system will take that node and update the browser accordingly. And when the next render phase comes, that virtual node will be compared with the previous one, and only if there was a true change between the two virtual nodes, it'll actually update the DOM. So this was done to kind of keep things efficient and not have to really worry about you modifying or interacting with the DOM directly. So here's a very simple example of a render method. You can see I'm just grabbing some properties from the widget itself, and then I'm returning this virtual node, and it's using JSX, and you can see it's pretty similar to markup. And wherever you see these curly braces, we're making references to variables. And you can see a lot of these attributes map directly to the JavaScript properties of the HTML elements. But we have a few here that don't map necessarily. For example, bind is in this case is used to provide the context for the click handler over here on the onClick. And we have a reference page in the SDK. We have a page detailing, giving more information behind each one of these special attributes that you can then you can use, how it works, and you also get some neat examples on where you would use them. And just FYI, at the end, we'll share a link to all this, to all these slides and the source code. So when you are implementing your widget, in TypeScript we can use decorators, and it's just a way of, it's essentially a function that will help you add or enhance a property, method, or a class. And we have a few here that we use pretty commonly when we are developing widgets. And you'll see more of these as we start building our widget. So subclass and declared are essential, or kind of glue whenever you want to create a class. Property will help you define property as well as how it should behave. So if you want to just pass a simple object and have it create underneath, under the scenes, instantiate a class for you from that object, you can use the AutoCast property of it. You can also make properties computed, so if it depends on other properties or something else. You can also make properties read-only, guaranteeing that they're not modified externally. And you can alias properties, so you can, if you want to reference a property by another one, just give it another name and alias, you can go ahead and do so. We have a shorthand of doing that. Renderable is very important in widgets, and what it does is it marks any property. It makes it renderable, and what this means is whenever the property is modified, it will automatically cause the widget to render at a later time. So this makes it easier as you wire your properties up. As you pass properties or update things, it'll automatically behind the scenes take care of updating itself. And we also have accessible handler, which helps us remove some boilerplate that you would need for some functions that react to clicks. If it removes the boilerplate needed to have them respond to enter key presses or space key presses as well. So here's just a very simple boilerplate to how you create a widget. So you can see here we're using some of the decorators that we mentioned before. But essentially we're just marking this class, that we're giving it a name, and we're just extending widget, and then we're exporting it. And then later on, the only thing that you would need to implement for a widget is the render method. And here's a very simple one where I'm returning, I want this render method to create a div with I'm a widget as its content. And if you have properties that would affect your UI, you would define properties using the property decorator. And then if it is essential in your UI, you would mark it renderable. So in this case, I have a name property with I'm a widget value, and that's what it's going to display the first time it renders. But if later on I update the name property, it's going to update accordingly. So before we go ahead and start building our widget, I just want to bring to talk about some of the new things that are coming in 4.7 to help simplify or enhance the widget development experience. And we have the unified CSS classes, animation hooks as well, and we have a new pattern to help make your widget fit well into other containing widgets, and I'll show an example in the following slide. For unified CSS classes, what this means is before you needed to keep your static CSS classes and dynamic ones separate, and we had different ways of setting them. So we went ahead and added a classes utility that to help you build the final class that will be passed along, that would be used for your element. And this means that we are now deprecating the join utility as well as the classes attribute, and you'll see an example of this in the next slide. So before you needed to, anything that was static and not changing as your widget's render method was called, you would use class, and sometimes depending on how many classes you were using, you would have to bring in this join utility. And for anything that was dynamic, you had to pass an object to the classes attribute, and we've made this simpler in 4.7 where you just use the class attribute, and by using the widget classes helper, you just pass everything inside, and internally it'll compute the final class and then set it, return it, and you can just set it as a class. But you can see here the arguments I'm passing are pretty similar to the one in the previous slide, where I have the base class, my mixin, which I don't want changing as my widget renders, but dynamic classes is still possible that it could change because it depends on the isActive property. We also have animation hooks, and you can use them. It supports CSS animations transitions, or if you have a JavaScript animation library, you can also use it. We'll have some documentation later on, but for now we have 3 methods that you can use. So as nodes get added or removed in the DOM, you can give special classes if you're going the CSS approach to these hooks that will be called whenever the node is entering or exiting, or if you have a JavaScript library, you can invoke whatever animation you want when the node is entering, exiting, or as it's updating in its animation. And we have a new utility for the CSS approach, CSS transition. And just a very simple example here in this render method, I am depending on this visible property to build my content. And if I am visible, I'm going to create my content element over here, and I give it a CSS transition to apply a fade-in effect when the node comes into the DOM, and similarly, when it exits, I want to fade it out. And this kind of pattern will enable, in this case, this is a very simple example showing the expand, so when the content, the search comes into play, it's going to apply that nice fade in, and when it exits, it's going to transition out. We also are adopting a new pattern for widgets, and we added a default icon class and label for our base widget class. And the idea behind it is that it's going to give hints to widgets that could serve as containers. For example, expand is already using it. So for example, I'll show you here. In 4.6, I would need to pass along this icon class to let the widget know which icon to display. But in 4.7, base map gallery already has a default icon class. So you can see in the corner here, it knows to display the proper icon. So the easiest thing that you could do is use an existing Esri icon font class name, and what this means is we have a reference page in our SDK where you can see all the different classes and the icons they represent. And just by passing any of these as the value for the icon class in your widget, it'll be the default icon it uses. So same idea with the label. You can provide a default label for your widget to use. And here's a very simple example. We define an icon class property with a base map icon, and for the label, we're just giving it a localized value of a string. So we went over how widgets are structured and separated into views and view models. We learned a little bit about how our base class works. And you learned a little bit about the whole render, why it's important, and what it expects as you are building your widget. And with that, I'll pass it along to Matt.
Thanks, Franco. Okay, so talk a little bit about styling here. So how do we do styling? We use a methodology called BEM, and stands for Block Element Modifier. And it allows us to write really good CSS, basically. And I'll go over that in a second. We also use Sass. So we use a preprocessor to compile to CSS. This gives us things like variables and mix-ins and cool things like that. So a little bit more about block element modifier, BEM. You can find out more about that by going to getbem.com. It's nothing to install or download or anything like that. But basically it scopes styles to blocks, elements, and modifiers, and allows you to have kind of a good framework for how you write your CSS and keep the specificity low. It's very semantic, low specificity. So here's an example using BEM. We would have the name of our widget as the root base class. If we have some kind of an input box in there, we would name it like this with the double underscores and then input. And if we have something that modifies the widget when it's loading, for example, to have some kind of a slightly different style, we would have a class named element widget -- loading. And then another modifier on the input for when it might be disabled. So a little bit about styling with Sass. Like I mentioned before, it's a CSS preprocessor. You can learn more about Sass at sasslang.com. Powered by CSS, allows you to do cool things like nesting and then variables, some of the big ones. Functions as well, so you can have something that's applied depending on different variables or whatever you need. Mix-ins, which would be like sections that you repeat very often. And inheritance you get too. So Sass makes it easier to restyle things and organize stuff, and in the end just write less code so you can be more efficient. So to recap, we use BEM for our Sass, or for our CSS, and we use Sass. Okay, so now we're going to get into actually building a widget, and the widget we're going to make is a simple bookmarks widget using the expand widget as well. So if we look at the documentation for bookmarks, it's on the web map, and there's a bookmarks property on the web map, and it's an object, it's an array of objects which are bookmarks which have a name and an extent. So here's the completed demo, what we're building. We have the expand widget in the top right corner here. We get a list of bookmarks with a label and a little icon. So if I click on something, it'll go to Palm Springs. I can go here, or the airport, or wherever. So that's our simple demo we're going to be building. So first of all, before we build the widget, we need to come up with how we're going to actually structure this thing. So here's a little bit how we're going to structure the view model. And so I'll be building the view model and setting up the HTML page. And then I'll turn it over to Franco to build the view of the widget and the Sass as well. So we're going to have a bookmarks view model here, and it's going to have a collection of bookmark items. It's going to have a state, which could either be a state of loading, a state of ready, or a state of disabled. We're going to have a property for the view, so we'll pass a view to our bookmarks view model so that it knows how to create the bookmark items by going to that view's map and getting the bookmarks from it. And then we're going to create a little helper accessor class bookmark item, which we're going to have the name and extent, but we're also going to add a property called active. And so this will be set to true while we're navigating to that bookmark's extent. And this will allow us to show like a little loading spinner while the bookmark is active. And the bookmark item also has a name, which would be a string. So this we benefit by having this as an accessor class. We'll be able to watch the properties of it and set things, and then be able to re-render the view depending on how those change. So let's get into building it. We have these steps, which will also be on the GitHub if you wanted to follow this at a later time. We have a start page, which is just a simple web map. So this will not have anything in there right now. Here's the folder we'll be working in, bookmark start. We have an HTML page, which just is setting up a map and a view. And we have some empty files, one for the widget, which is empty. We have a folder for bookmarks. This is where we're keeping our logic of the widget. So we have the view model here, and we have our bookmark item here. So let's follow along the steps and build this thing. So the first steps we're going to want to do is go into our HTML. We're going to want to add a style sheet for our bookmarks. This file is going to be right here, and it's also just empty right now. But we'll get to it. So we're just going to put this style sheet in the head of our document. Right there. Next thing we're going to do, very important, is set up our Dojo config. And I'll explain this in a second. We're going to want to put this above where we reference the JavaScript API. And what this is going to allow us to do is to set up a custom package for where our widget's located. So when we request something called demo / bookmarks widget, it'll know where to go to get that bookmarks widget. So you have to set up a package to be able to do that, so it'll know where to go get it. The next thing we're going to want to do is require the 2 widgets we need. And so if we go down into where our JavaScript is, we're going to, under the map view, we're going to require the expand widget and the bookmarks widget. And then make sure to reference these right here. Expand and bookmarks. Okay, fix that a little bit. All right. So now we're importing the bookmarks, even though it's not built yet. We have it set up. Then we're going to want to initialize it. We're going to do that after the view. And we're going to pass the bookmark widget our view so it knows how to get the bookmarks. And then we're going to set up the expand widget right under that. So now we have the expand widget there, and it's going to be past the view as well, and the content of the expand widget is going to be the bookmarks widget. And then we're going to add the bookmarks widget to the view's user interface and position it in the top right. So that's it for the HTML steps. Now let's start actually building the widget classes. So the first thing we're going to want to do is build that helper class I mentioned called the bookmarks item. This is going to be a really simple class. So we're just going to put it in there and talk about it for a second. So this is a class written in TypeScript using basically just accessor, extending accessor, and using extent. So we have a class of bookmark item that extends accessor. We have our properties here. I mentioned active already. It's just going to be a Boolean property. By default, we're going to have it false. We also have an extent property, which we're going to autocast into an extent if it's just an object. And that's going to be null by default. And then our name property for whatever we want to call the bookmark. And by default, that's null as well. So save that. That should be good. Next steps, let's set up the view model. So for the view model, we're going to start out with a pretty basic class as well. And we're going to kind of build it up. So kind of the same thing. We have our TypeScript dependencies. We're importing a few decorators. We have an accessor, which our bookmarks view model is going to extend. And right now, it's just an empty class. So what we want to do is we're going to set up the bookmark items first. And we want the bookmark items to be a collection of bookmark item. So we're going to have to require Esri or import Esri core collection right here. And we're going to set up a constant for that type of collection. So we got that there. Now we're going to add the properties of our view model. So I'm just going to copy these properties. We're going to go back into our code. Just going to put them inside the class. So we have 3 properties. One is the bookmark items. This is that collection I talked about. So it's going to be a collection of this bookmark item class we created. And then we have a state, which is going to be a computed property that is read-only. And so this is going to be either ready, loading, or disabled. And it's going to depend on the view. So if it has a view and the view is ready, then it's going to be the ready state. If it has a view and it's not yet ready, it's going to be in a loading state. And in any other case, it'll be disabled. So we're seeing right now there's a little bit error with the state type. What we want to do is actually create a type for that. So we're going to go up here and create our state type. So now we have a type of state, which is either of those three things. And now it doesn't complain anymore. The next thing we're going to want to do is import map view, because our view property depends on map view, and so right now it's complaining about that. So let's import it. That's all good. So now our properties are set up. Now we're going to actually watch the collection. So we need a couple of little utilities here. Put these in. So the first one is handle registry, and this is a utility class to be able to group handles and listeners and be able to remove them as a group or add them as a group. And the next one is watch utils, which will allow us to watch accessor properties and then do things when they change. So we're going to use those. Those are both very beneficial. And we're going to use our first one in a variable on our class. So I'm going to go after the properties here. I'm just going to add a variable called handles, and this is going to use our handle registry. And we'll see how they're used in a second. So the next thing we're going to want to do is set up our lifecycle of our widget. Franco talked a little bit about this earlier, how we have our constructor and things like that. We're going to, on initialize of this widget, we're going to add a handle that watches the view. So whenever the view is added or changed, we're going to call a private method called view updated and pass the view to that. And then if our widget is destroyed, we're going to destroy all the handles so that we clean up our widget and there's no loose handles there. And we're going to set the view to a null and remove any bookmark items that are there. So now we go on to our private methods. Our first one, I'm going to put these down at the bottom here. Okay, so this is that view updated method I mentioned. It's going to get past the map view, and it's going to be called anytime the view is changed or added. And what we want to do is remove any map handles that we have. And if there is no view, we're just going to stop there. But if we do have a view, we're going to wait for that view to be ready. And then once it's ready, we're going to create a handle to watch for that view's map. Because we need to have the map there to be able to get the bookmarks. And that's going to call a private method map updated. So that's what we need to add next. Here's the map updated private method. And that's going to get past the map of the view. And if we don't have if the view doesn't have a map, we're just going to stop there. But if the view does have a map, we're going to look at the map's bookmarks. So map.get bookmarks. And then we're going to look at the class's bookmark items. And if we don't, we're going to remove all, no matter what. And then we're going to add the ones that we get from the map. So basically, if you change the map, it'll clear out the existing bookmarks and then add new ones. So now you're seeing it cannot find map. So we need to import map as well. So go back up to the top here. Paste that in, import map. Cool, no problems. So now we have all the methods we need to be able to get the bookmarks. The last thing we want to do is set up a public method to actually go to a bookmark. So down here, before the private methods, I'm going to add my public methods. And there's just going to be one. It's going to be called goto. So we pass goto a bookmark item that we want to go to, and it's going to return a promise. So if we don't get a bookmark item, we're just going to reject immediately with a resolved promise. And if we don't have a view, we're going to do the same thing. And they have two different errors. So this is just like an error handling state. If we do have a bookmark item to use, we're going to set that bookmark item to active so that we can say that it's going to this bookmark. And then we're going to actually go to the bookmark with the view.goto and use the bookmarks extent. So then we go to the bookmark, go to the bookmarks extent, and then after that's done, we're going to set active to false again. And so it just returns the view animation promise right there. So it's complaining about needing promise utils. So we'll add that next. There you go at the top. Import one more thing. Okay, promise utils is there. Now it's not complaining about it. So now we should be able to compile this thing using TypeScript. So if I go to my terminal, TSC, okay, it looks like it compiled. That's good. Next thing you want to do is kind of go into our index page where we have this blank thing. Right now it's just going to kind of complain because bookmarks doesn't exist. But if I open it up and I go look for bookmarks view model, then it's going to load the view model. I'm going to comment out this expand because we don't need it right now. Okay, good. So we got that. And then I should be able to, click the steps. So I should be able to log the bookmarks there. The next thing I want to do is bookmarks view model equals bookmarks, just because it's the view model right now, and I want a global variable to be able to test this thing. So there we go. So if I log that out, I can see this is my class. I have bookmark items, I have a state. The state's ready. I have my view that's passed to it. I have bookmark items, which is a collection, and there's 6 items in there, and they're accessor classes with active, extent, etc. So what I could do as well, just to kind of test out that, going to the wrong thing. So I could test out going to the first bookmark. I could do this. Clear that. So first bookmark, bookmarks view model, bookmark items get the first item, and then bookmark view model go to the first bookmark, and then so that'll go to it. So I can kind of test out the view model there. Okay, so back to our steps. That's it. The next steps will be setting up the view. So I'm going to turn over to Franco now, and he's going to build the view for you guys, and then configure the Sass.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start off by creating our view. So I have a file here that's empty, bookmarks.tsx, and tsx is just an extension in TypeScript that lets it know that we're going to be using JSX inside. So let's start off by creating a very simple class, and I have my steps on my right over here, and I'll just be copying steps. So you see here we have that boilerplate I showed earlier on to kind of show how to create a widget. And what you can see here, I am just defining this class to be demo bookmarks. That's going to be its class name. And we're extending widget, and we are calling it bookmarks and exporting it. So before I go into the next steps, what I'm going to do is just add a lot of these imports that we'll be using across these steps to kind of make the walkthrough easier. So just kind of, Matt already talked about a lot of these, but we are using watch utils as well. We're bringing all these decorators from that to build an accessor class over here, and then we are bringing handle registry to help us manage any sort of handles. And then these are to help us build our widget. Then we are bringing dependencies from the bookmarks widget itself. And for typings, I bring in map view because one of our properties is going to be typed to that. And we also have here a module that will have all the translations that we might need in our widget. And right below here, this is one of the patterns that we use when we're developing widgets, and we have this CSS lookup object, and what we use it for is to keep all of our references, all the references to the classes that we're using in this object, and we just look at it as a lookup table. So now I can move on. And remember that I said the only class that you need to implement for a widget was render. So just by copying and pasting over here, this is not going to be our final widget, of course, but we are going to be creating a div, and we are using the base CSS class that's over here, so you can see how this lookup, how we're using it. And if I go back to my application, initially it wasn't loading because we didn't have anything in this file, and also my IDE is set up to compile TypeScript in the background, so that's why we are able to go ahead and refresh and see what's going on. So I have the expand here widget with our bookmarks, and you won't see anything right now because we're not styling anything and there's no content. But if I inspect this, you can see that we have our actual rendered node being generated. It's too big. So it's over here. This is that simple div with that class that I showed you before. But obviously we're not going to stop here, so let's go back and continue. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to define the rendering logic for each of my bookmark items. And one thing that I recommend that you do is make sure that if you have pieces, bigger pieces inside of your widget, it's really useful to create smaller rendering methods and then just call them as they're needed. It really helps clean up the code. So this is right over here, the render bookmark method is going to receive a bookmark item that Matt showed you earlier on. And what I'm doing is I'll be using two of the items properties. One of them is to determine whether I want to add this CSS class to the element when the item is active or not. And name will be the actual content of the bookmark. So you can see it right here. And then you can see the structure of the actual item itself. It's going to be a list item, and with a few spans inside for the icon and the name. And we are setting the class itself here, and you can see the class for the other elements here as well. And I'm setting up, this is for a later step, but I'm setting up some data that will be processed in an event handler later on in this element, and we use the data attributes for that. So I have this other function here that's gonna go iterate over the bookmark items from the view model, and it's gonna call that render bookmark method that we just saw to create that list of bookmark items that I want to display. So you can see I'm getting some errors here from TypeScript, and it's because I'm referencing the view model, but we haven't defined the property for the view model. So let's go ahead and bring that in, and I'll talk through how you would set this up. So remember those decorators we showed earlier? So what we're doing here is essentially, we have an alias here. So we have a property on the widget itself, but it's really going to use the view model's view property. So this is kind of a shortcut of adding proxy properties to your classes. And right below here, I am bringing in the view model that Matt showed, that he created. And the important thing to see here is that I am interested in the state property and making it renderable. So whenever the view model or the view model state property changes, it's going to call the render method automatically. So now we've wired up we're bringing in the view model, and we have an alias here for the view, which is being used when the widget is created. And if I go to the index page, you'll see that. It's being passed the view, but that's not the key thing here. So going back. So I'll update the render method to take advantage of the render bookmarks method. And now what I'm doing is I am rendering those bookmarks from the view model, as you saw, and then I'm grabbing the state property from the view model itself. And I'm checking to see if the state of the view model is ready and I have actual bookmarks, bookmark list items. I'm going to ahead and create this element that will hold the nodes that I created earlier. And if it's not ready, I'm just gonna return null, and this would just not render anything. And this will be the content of that base element that we showed earlier. So if I refresh the page and expand, you'll see I'm getting the bookmark items. I'm actually going to go ahead myself and bring in some style so you can see it better. So if I refresh the page, you should see now something that looks much nicer. There we go. So these are the individual bookmark items, but you can see if I click on them, nothing happens because we haven't set up anything when you click on them. So let's go ahead and add that. So the key thing that I'm going to be updating in my render method is I'm going to update it so that the bookmark item is going to be using an on-click handler and a key down handler. And I'm also going to allow it to be focusable, but we'll talk about that later. And I'm also going, it's complaining because I'm referencing a method that's not existing. So I'll just go ahead and add that. So the go-to bookmark, what it does is it's going to use the current element from that event. And remember that bookmark data item property that I added? It's going to get that from the element itself, and then it's going to call the viewModels go-to method and go to the actual bookmark item. So now, if I update the page, we should now see it function when you click on it. And notice how that loading indicator keeps on, it just stays, it doesn't go away. That's because we've rendered the item and we added the CSS class for when it's active, but when the item itself is no longer active, we're not updating anything. So that's where we need to make sure that render is called again. So let's go and wire that up. So we're going to add some lifecycle methods over here. And just what we're doing is we are going to be watching for the viewModel bookmark items. Whenever they change, we're going to call this bookmark items change method that I'm about to paste shortly. I'm also going to bring a handles registry to keep track of all these handles and make it easier to clean up. So whenever the bookmark items change, I'm going to remove the handles that I added initially. Actually, that's all being managed by the widget itself, so it'll get automatically destroyed, but we can still rely on the handles to, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Whenever the bookmark items change, it's going to grab the bookmark items from the view model. And if there were any previous handles, it's just going to remove them, similar to what Matt showed earlier. And for each one of these bookmark items, we're going to watch whenever the active and name properties change. And whenever that happens, we're just going to call schedule render. And this is a method that just lets our widget know, hey, we changed. Could you please update later on and update the UI if necessary. So for each one of these items, we're creating a handle and we are just keeping track of them for better cleanup, and we're just scheduling render when this method is invoked. So if I refresh and I check it again, it should always, you'll notice that it's much shorter because it's now updating whenever the bookmark item active property changes. So if I load the application and create the expand, you see this kind of weird state where it's loading, but we don't show anything. So we can go ahead a step further and kind of make it easier on the eyes and provide a loader to make it easier, let the user know that we're loading data behind the scenes, please wait. So the things that change is I'm creating this node for the loader, It's just a few HTML elements with a few CSS classes. Same as before, getting the bookmark nodes. The only thing that changed is that if my state is now loading, I'm going to return that loader node as the content for my widget. So now if I refresh the page and expand, you'll see this nice loader over there while the items are being processed. So another thing that I could improve is when the items come into play, it's just they just show up. So I can make this easier by adding an animation. So let's update the render method. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating a fade-in animation. All it does is, depending on whether you want it to apply when the node enters or when it exits, you would give it an enter or exit parameter here, and then give it the class that will be in charge of that animation. And I am going to be using the enter animation attribute here and passing it along. So now, when it comes into play, it's going to very quickly fade in. It's very, very, very quick, but you can see that. Very subtle. So last things that I want to do is make our widget more friendly for screen readers to improve accessibility. So what I'll be doing is adding an ARIA label. These properties are used by browsers, the screen readers, to make it easy and kind of play well with screen readers. And also for my bookmark item, I also want to give it these roles for the same purpose. These attributes to make it easier to play with screen readers. And lastly, I mentioned the icon class and label being kind of helpers if you want to give hints to one of our widgets in terms of what icon to display by default or a label. So I'll just define these properties on the widget itself. And so far, the default icon is like an empty square. But now, just by doing that simple change, it's going to show a little bookmarks item right here. And it's using a class from that icon font page that I showed you earlier. Cool. So that is the whole view. And now I'm going to move to the Sass. And what is important to know here is not, if for me going step by step, it's not really crucial, but I want to do it to just show you tying back to that BEM strategy that we've been using and how we can use Sass to make our CSS cleaner. So first off, we're going to start with our block class. And in this case, it's going to be the root of our widget, which is demo bookmarks. Then comes all the elements that will be held inside of this widget, all the different pieces you could say. So we have the loader, the actual list element, and the individual bookmark items. And we have a few here for when it's hovered or if it's the first state. And this syntax that you're seeing with the ampersand is just kind of a shortcut in Sass to let it know to use the parent class. So in this case, for example, here, let me just bump up the size. So this one here is basically the same as demo bookmarks loading. So this ampersand allows us to use it as a shortcut. And I'm also defining here classes for the item icon and the name. And now I can add the modifiers. And remember that can be applied to either the item or the root of the widget. So these ones will be here. This is to reflect when the item is active. And I will add some for the animation itself, and these can be outside. But note, sorry, I made an error. So this is to kind of set up those classes that I used in my animation. And lastly, since if I wanted to, I could also add some styles to make it look correct if the page is using an RTL attribute. So what this will do is just flip some of the animations that you saw in the layout. And it's just based on overrides and whether the HTML has an RTL property. And I'll show that right now. So you can see there, it flipped the layout just by using those overrides. So that was kind of a quick view of how we're using BEM and Sass to create the classes for the CSS for our widgets. And I believe with that, I'll pass it to Matt.
All right, thanks, Franco. So with that, we built a widget. Let's recap this. So widgets, what they are, single pieces of user interface components. We use them so you can reuse them throughout your application or in different applications, and you can swap them out real easy. Our widget framework, Esri widget, is what we use to create all our widgets. It extends that class. We talked about constructing a widget using view models and views. And then we went into styling widgets with Sass, and we talked about BEM as our methodology for naming our classes so that they don't conflict and they're all following a single approach. Another suggested session for you guys to check out if you want to know more about widgets. We have one tomorrow, I believe, around the same time, if not the same time, on customizing widgets. And so we'll go into basically extending widgets, more into Sass styling, using widget themes, and creating different views for widgets. There's some more resources here. I think these are all on our docs. Implementing accessor is important to know for creating your own helper classes for widgets. Setting up TypeScript. There's doc here on how to get that started to create widgets. So this is all under our API under guide, working with the API, and there's sections for widgets and stuff like that. As well as our widget development, which is there too. These are all the key topics we kind of went over here. And then just a link to our SDK. You can get there real easy just by going to js.arcgis.com. It'll take you right there. And we also have guides on styling and widget patterns as well. So with that, we'll open up questions. The first question you may have is where to get this, and the link is right there at the bottom. esriurl.com/buildwidgetsds2018. DS for Dev Summit. So I guess, yeah, we'll take your questions if you guys have any. We had on-click and on-key up, right? On key down. We have them both because on key down is used for the enter key and the space key. So when we set up that accessible handler, that is basically looking for those keys and setting up the events for them. That's what that decorator was for.
What it does is it'll take the click handler and wraps it in this function that when a key is pressed, it'll check whether it's enter key or space, and then based on that, it'll invoke it or not.
Yeah.
Any best practices for turning custom widgets into like a package of some kind, so like an import?
I think by packages, do you mean inside of the AMD or what kind of?
Yes, like an AMD, you pull from Node or some other package manager.
I'm not sure about the NPM approach, but if you are using TypeScript and are using our typings and you create the module for the widget itself, I don't see why you couldn't publish it and import it somewhere else. But we don't have this mechanism for bringing in widgets as modules from some other places.
Yeah.
You might be interested in talking to René Rubalcaba. He's in the JavaScript island, and he's working on the CLI that will make that easier. So the idea is that there would be an established pattern and a pool of widgets that you can use this CLI to kind of create your boilerplate for an application and then import different widgets from different places. So you might want to talk to him. Cool. Yes. Say that again. Why are we? Why are we using autocasting?
Why are we not using autocasting for require?
Was that
Imports.
for the property we set up to use autocasting, or? Yes.
Yes.
It does. So depending on how you I'll just show some example here, code.
I'm gonna switch over.
So yes, thank you. So for example, this property here, it's set up to autocast to the bookmarks view model instance. So what this does is you don't need to create an instance and pass it to the view model. You can just pass an empty, a plain object, and it'll set it up for you and create it for you. But this is how you would set it up. And it's using that property decorator. Cool. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Is all this working on Internet Explorer 11?
Yes, it should. Yes. Yeah. We support i11 and
Edge.
the rest of the modern
Everything
browsers.
else,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's IE11 plus and Edge. So yeah, it will work.
ArcGIS, but Windows 7?
The operating system shouldn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's just a browser. So i11.
If
it
IE11
works.
will go on 7, I'm not sure. I think it does, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It will run on IE11 no matter what operating system it's on.
If you have i11 in your machine, it'll work. Yes. So that's actually a good point you bring. And one thing that I can promote more is we have this repository here for widget patterns, and we'll be adding more and updating this to kind of show. We have a collection here of very small focused patterns that you can apply in your widgets. And one of them is actually using dgrid. So you would import dgrid. In this case, it's an external dependency. But once you have it available, you can look at this snippet and get an idea of.
That's great. Having a snippet is
Cool.
Yeah, we're going to promote this more, this patterns thing, to all the common ways you can use kind of widgets and stuff like that with TSX and or JSX. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.